Happy Friday. You have made it to the end of another week. Glad you have spent it with us. This coming Sunday, we're going to share the Lord's Supper. So, the reason I'm talking about this now is one, I want you to be prepared in case you're watching us online. If you're watching us online, go ahead and get what you need ready to share with us the Lord's Supper. Now, I know if you were here, we'd be sharing a little piece of bread and a little glass of juice. And with COVID, we've had to go to those plastic things, which are just so tacky. But we've had to do it because of the COVID thing. So what I want you to do is find whatever bread you want to use and whatever grape juice or anything like that that you would want to use to share the Lord's Supper with us when we do it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Jesus used the most common elements that he could find. You would think a supper this important, this significant, Jesus told his disciples, I really look forward to this moment. Why? Because what would happen in the moment of the Lord's Supper would explain everything that would follow. The crucifixion, his death, his sacrifice, what it would mean, all of that would forever be viewed by the disciples through the lens of the Lord's Supper. And he used the most common stuff. He used a piece of bread. Now, I don't know about you, but I love bread. And every time my server says, would you like bread? Yes, I want bread. Bring bread and lots of butter because I want to. It's at every meal. I have bread for breakfast. I have bread for lunch. I have bread for dinner somehow. In fact, a meal is not a meal to me unless there is bread, and that's Jesus' whole point. Every time you sit down, every time somebody hands you a basket of bread and you reach in and grab the roll and you tear it in half, you remember. You remember the body of Christ that was broken for you. Now, don't say that phrase, body of Christ, too fast or too quickly. Remember, the essence of the good news is Christ is God incarnate, God in human form, God who got so close to us he could touch us, a God who invited us to touch him, a God who wanted to be that real to us. This is that body that took all of your sin and took it with him to the cross. So every time you're at breakfast and you get a piece of toast, you pull a biscuit open to put the jelly on it, you remember. Every time you're at lunch and you tear a roll in two, every time you're at supper, dinner, and you get the fancy rolls. Every time you reach into a bag of bread, grab a couple of slices to make a sandwich, and you lay them out on the counter side by side, and you see that bread, you remember. You see what Jesus has done? He's put himself right in the middle of every moment of our day. Remember, every time you touch a piece of bread, this is my body. Now, our culture is a little different than Jesus' culture. In Jesus' culture, it wasn't unusual for there to be wine at the table, for there to be wine at every meal. In fact, if you go to the Middle East now, if you go to Europe, it's not unusual for wine to be served with just about every course. Now, in our country, it's a little different. We have changed that wine, expression wine, to grape juice, and there's a history behind that, and I don't have time to go into that now. But again, Jesus chose something that would be very, very simple. A glass of wine. One of my friends did the Lord's Supper one time, and I was in that service with him, and he said on the day that Christ was betrayed, he took the glass of wine and held it up. When he did, he saw his own face reflected in blood, and he knew what it would cost. I've never forgotten that. It's a beautiful moment. Same thing. Jesus took that little glass of wine, you a little glass of juice, and he said, every time you do this, every time you sit down, every time you hold this cup, you remember. You remember what it cost. You remember the blood that dripped from his hands, poured from his side, striped his face, and pooled around the bottom of the cross. You remember that's what your sin cost. It's not that you got away with anything. It's not nobody knows. That's what your sin cost, what my sin cost. And here's what else you remember. What it cost Jesus is what it cost you. He gave his life, and he calls for you and me to give our life. So every time you hold that cup, you remember what was paid for your salvation and what we will gladly give in response to our freedom. So grab whatever bread, cracker, cookie you want to use. It's not important. What's important is that you remember. Take whatever kind of juice, whatever kind of beverage you want. It's not important. The important thing is that you remember. This is my body. Remember. This is my blood. Remember. How dare we forget? I'll give you 60 seconds. Think about it. I'll see you Monday.